The day my daughter-in-law Margaret slid the deadbolt into place, locking me in the sparse guest room of my son's Victorian townhouse, I heard her honeyed voice explaining to their dinner guests that poor Eleanor was feeling unwell and wouldn't be joining them. I stood frozen by the door, still dressed in my carefully chosen outfit for the evening, listening as crystal glasses clinked and polite laughter floated up from below. As their footsteps retreated down the hallway, I reached into my handbag and ran my fingers across the embossed leather folder hidden at the bottom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside lay the deed to Hawthorne Estate, the magnificent 22-acre property with its sprawling Georgian mansion overlooking Lake Champlain, that had been in my family for generations. The estate my son James had no idea existed. The estate I had kept secret for nearly 30 years, waiting for the right moment. That moment had finally arrived. I settled onto the narrow twin bed that dominated the windowless room, my thoughts drifting to how I'd ended up here. At 72, I had never imagined I would be treated like an inconvenient heirloom, tucked away whenever company arrived. Yet for the past 8 months, since selling my modest home at Margaret's insistence to help with their renovations, I'd been relegated to this converted storage space on the 3rd floor of their Cambridge townhouse. The room was a monument to Margaret's true feelings about me. While the rest of their home featured designer furniture and custom wallpaper, my quarters contained cast-offs and remnants. The mattress sagged in the middle from years of disuse before I arrived. The dresser, a battered piece from James's college apartment, had drawers that stuck in humid weather. A single lamp with a crooked shade provided inadequate light for reading, my primary escape during long, lonely evenings. Most telling was the lock, installed just 3 weeks after I moved in. "For your safety, Mother Hampton," Margaret had explained, with practiced concern. "You've been so forgetful lately, wandering at night. We wouldn't want you to fall on the stairs." I had never wandered at night, nor had I fallen. At 72, I still swam 40 laps 3 times weekly at the community center and volunteered teaching art to children with disabilities. My mind remained sharp enough to complete the New York Times crossword daily, in pen. But Margaret had been carefully constructing a narrative of my decline since the day James proposed to her 7 years ago. Tonight was merely the culmination of a patient campaign. Earlier that day, I'd overheard them discussing the dinner party, an important gathering of partners from James's architectural firm and their spouses. "Mother will enjoy meeting everyone," I'd mentioned while helping prepare lunch. Margaret's smile had tightened at the corners. "Oh, Eleanor, these events can be so taxing. All that conversation, standing for hours. At your age—" "I'm hardly infirm," I'd replied mildly, continuing to slice cucumbers for the salad. "I attended symphonies regularly before moving here." James, always eager to avoid conflict, had intervened. "Mom, these people can be overwhelming. Lots of shop talk. You'd be bored to tears." "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to embarrass you," I'd said, setting down the knife. The hurt must have shown in my eyes because James had quickly backpedaled. "That's not what I meant. Of course you wouldn't embarrass us. It's just—" "James has been working toward partnership for years," Margaret had interrupted. "Tonight needs to be perfect. You understand, don't you?" I understood perfectly. I was the faded wallpaper they were planning to replace during their renovations, present but not meant to be noticed, tolerated until they could properly dispose of me. After lunch, I'd excused myself and retreated to my room. I'd opened my closet, pushing aside the few belongings I'd been allowed to bring when I moved in. At the back, hidden beneath winter sweaters, was a locked wooden box. Inside lay the deed to Hawthorne Estate, along with photographs, financial statements, and legal documents, evidence of the considerable wealth I had concealed even from my late husband. The Hawthorne fortune had originated with my grandfather's shipping business in the 1920s. When my parents died in a boating accident, I inherited everything as their only child. By then, I had already married Richard Hampton, a brilliant history professor with modest means and a gentle soul. We shared a deep love of art, literature, and simple pleasures. What we didn't share was my belief in financial disclosure. Richard had grown up impoverished, the son of a factory worker who drank away most of his paycheck. As a child, Richard had sworn to succeed through intelligence and hard work alone. When we met, he was proudly self-sufficient, refusing even small gifts that might suggest charity. Revealing my inheritance would have wounded his pride irreparably. So I maintained the estate and investments through a private trust, living on our academic salaries in our cozy colonial home, planning to surprise him with the truth upon his retirement. But Richard never reached retirement. A sudden heart attack took him when James was 17, just beginning to consider colleges. In my grief, revealing the estate seemed pointless. Instead, I continued our modest lifestyle, using only enough of my hidden resources to ensure James received an excellent education without student debt, a gift I presented as careful saving and a small life insurance policy. James never questioned this explanation, too absorbed in his budding architectural career to wonder about financial details. When he met Margaret during a restoration project on a historical building, she was the interior designer hired by the developer, I was initially pleased. She seemed ambitious and stylish, if somewhat reserved around me. Only after their engagement did I notice how her attitude toward me shifted depending on who was watching. With James present, I was dear Eleanor, who received air kisses and superficial compliments. Alone, she assessed me coolly, eyes calculating as she subtly questioned my capabilities, suggesting I was becoming a burden rather than an asset. I made allowances, understanding that adjusting to in-laws could be challenging. When James's career advanced and they purchased the townhouse in Cambridge's historic district, I congratulated them sincerely. When Margaret began suggesting my own home was too much to manage, I dismissed it as misplaced concern. Then came the water damage to my kitchen last winter. What should have been a simple insurance repair became, under Margaret's guidance, evidence that I couldn't cope anymore. James, increasingly absent due to work demands, relied on his wife's reports of my supposed decline. Within weeks, I found myself agreeing to sell my home, ostensibly temporarily, to help them afford renovations, while giving me the support you need, Mother Hampton. Now, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the muffled sounds of the dinner party below, I finally recognized the truth I had been avoiding. There would be no return to independence in Margaret's plan. This room, this glorified closet, was to be my final destination before being shipped off to whatever lovely retirement community she had undoubtedly already selected. I opened the leather folder and traced my fingers across the deed to Hawthorne Estate. For decades, I had protected this secret out of respect for Richard's memory, then out of habit, and finally out of a misguided desire not to disrupt James's perception of our family history. But as the voices from downstairs grew more animated with wine and camaraderie, a gathering I had been deemed unworthy to join, I made my decision. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning long overdue. I waited until the house fell silent around midnight, the last guest having departed and my son and his wife retired to their master suite on the second floor. Only then did I retrieve the wooden box from its hiding place and spread its contents across my bed. Beyond the deed to Hawthorne Estate lay evidence of a life I had kept separate from my identity as Eleanor Hampton, retired art teacher and widow of a respected academic. Bank statements from accounts in 3 countries. Investment portfolios diversified across industries I'd studied carefully over decades. Insurance documents for art collections stored in climate-controlled facilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. property tax assessments for not just Hawthorne Estate, but 2 additional properties: an apartment in Paris overlooking the Seine, and a small villa on the Italian coast, both maintained by local management companies and occasionally rented to select clientele. The Hampton fortune had not merely been preserved, but had flourished under my quiet stewardship. While living on my teacher's pension and the modest survivor benefits from Richard's university position, I had leveraged my business acumen, inherited from my grandfather and refined through careful study, to triple the original assets. I lifted a faded photograph from the bottom of the box. It showed Hawthorne Estate in its full glory, the Georgian mansion with its symmetrical wings and classical portico, surrounded by formal gardens that transitioned to wilder woodlands as they approached the lake. The photograph had been taken the summer before I met Richard, when I was 22 and had just assumed responsibility for the family holdings. The estate had been closed shortly after, its valuable furnishings covered, its rooms maintained by a skeleton staff who believed the property was held in trust due to complex family litigation. This fiction, established by my attorney, had preserved the estate's privacy for nearly 5 decades. Only 3 people knew the truth about my financial situation. My attorney, Theodore Winters, now in his 80s but still sharp as a tack; his daughter, Elise, who had joined his practice 15 years ago; and my closest friend, Vivian, who had kept my confidence through 50 years of friendship. Not even James knew, though there had been moments when I'd nearly told him. I selected several key documents and placed them in the leather portfolio, along with recent photographs of the estate taken during my quarterly weekend art retreats, trips, that were actually visits to oversee maintenance and updates to the property. James and Margaret believed I stayed with former colleagues during these absences. Margaret had even once suggested, with poorly disguised relief, that perhaps I should consider making these arrangements permanent. My financial independence wasn't merely measured in property and investments. Among the documents was a detailed prenuptial agreement between James and Margaret that I had insisted on reviewing before their wedding, one of the few times I had asserted myself against Margaret's wishes. I had been surprised to discover clauses that would leave James vulnerable in case of divorce. When I raised concerns, my son had dismissed them with the confidence of the deeply enamored. Margaret had been icily polite afterward, her perfect smile never reaching her eyes. I had kept a copy, along with privately commissioned financial investigations into Margaret's background that revealed troubling patterns. 3 broken engagements to increasingly wealthy men. A previous marriage at 22 to a tech entrepreneur dissolved after 18 months with a surprisingly generous settlement. Numerous lines of credit, steadily increasing in limit. A pattern of employment at firms where she cultivated relationships with wealthy clients rather than colleagues. None of this had proven she was after James's modest assets, of course. But now, with Margaret successfully isolating me, the one person who might question her narratives, I regretted not being more forthright with my son years ago. I replaced most items in the wooden box, but kept out my phone and a small leather notebook. Though Margaret had suggested I no longer needed a complicated smartphone at my age, offering instead a simplified device with large buttons and pre-programmed numbers, I had insisted on maintaining my independence in this small way. Now I was grateful for my stubbornness as I opened a secure messaging app and contacted both Theodore and Elise. Proceeding with Hawthorne disclosure tomorrow. Please prepare all documents discussed in Contingency Plan C. We'll need car service at 11 a.m. Elise responded almost immediately despite the late hour. Confirmed. Will alert the estate staff. Theodore sends his regards and says, "About time, Ellie." I smiled at the use of my childhood nickname. Theodore had been my father's friend before becoming my trusted advisor. He alone had understood my reasons for maintaining the separation between my married life and my inheritance, though he had questioned the wisdom of continuing the charade after Richard's death. Next, I messaged Vivian. The time has come. Operation Hawthorne commences tomorrow. Are you available to witness? Her response was immediate and typical. Darling, I've had my outfit picked out for this occasion for 15 years. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Text when you want me. To make my entrance. Dramatic timing is everything. I couldn't help but chuckle. Vivian had been a theater actress in her youth before becoming a drama teacher, and she still approached life as a series of potential scenes to be maximized for effect. She had never understood my reticence about my wealth, but had respected my choices while maintaining a running commentary on what she would do with all those lovely millions. Finally, I opened the notebook and reviewed the careful observations. I'd been recording since moving into James and Margaret's home. Dates and times when medications I didn't need appeared by my bedside water glass. Conversations I'd overheard between Margaret and her friends, discussing memory care options and asset protection. The gradual disappearance of my possessions, explained away as being stored in their basement but actually donated or discarded without my consent. Most damning were the photographs I'd discreetly taken of financial documents left carelessly on James's home office desk. Documents showing mounting debt from renovations far exceeding the proceeds from my home sale, and a second mortgage Margaret had convinced James to take out using forged signatures on power of attorney documents I had never signed. The evidence painted a clear picture. Margaret was systematically establishing a narrative of my incompetence while simultaneously accessing my modest assets and isolating me from anyone who might contradict her version of events. Tomorrow would not merely be about revealing my hidden wealth. It would be about protecting my son from a woman who saw him, and me, as nothing more than means to financial security. I returned the box to its hiding place, placed the leather portfolio under my pillow, and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. For the first time since moving into this stifling room, I fell asleep with a sense of anticipation rather than resignation. The reckoning would not wait another day. I awakened before dawn, my mind already alert despite the early hour. Old habits from decades of teaching had conditioned me to rise with the sun, a practice Margaret found charmingly quaint but unnecessary in retirement. As I performed my morning routine with the limited resources available in my cramped quarters, a basin of water rather than a proper shower, since using the main bathroom before Margaret awoke would constitute an intrusion on their privacy. I reflected on the journey that had led me to this crossroads. I was born Eleanor Catherine Hawthorne in 1951, the only child of William and Genevieve Hawthorne. My childhood at the estate had been one of privilege tempered by responsibility. My parents, unlike many of their wealthy contemporaries, insisted I understand the business operations that supported our lifestyle. By 16, I was accompanying my father to board meetings. By 20, I was managing small portions of our investment portfolio under my grandfather's watchful guidance. "Wealth is not merely to be enjoyed, Eleanor," my grandfather would say, his voice gravelly from years of cigars. "It is to be respected, protected, and utilized for something beyond oneself." This philosophy shaped my approach to inheritance. When my parents' sailing accident left me alone at 22, I found myself the reluctant steward of the Hawthorne legacy. While my contemporaries were discovering themselves through travel or education, I was reviewing property holdings and approving business decisions with advisors twice my age. I might have continued in this isolated existence had I not enrolled in an art history course at the local college, a small indulgence to balance the weight of my responsibilities. There, I met Richard Hampton, a young history professor whose passion for medieval architecture animated his entire being when he lectured. His wire-rimmed glasses would slip down his nose as he grew excited about flying buttresses and rose windows, and he seemed perpetually surprised when students actually found his enthusiasm contagious. I was no longer exactly a student at 23, but neither was I comfortable in the rarefied social circles of my parents' friends. Richard, 5 years my senior, represented something I had rarely encountered. A person whose passion was driven by intellectual curiosity rather than financial gain. Our courtship was conducted through museum visits and historical architecture tours. Richard lived in a book-filled apartment on a professor's modest salary, and I found his simple lifestyle refreshingly authentic after the calculated socialization of wealthy society. When he proposed 6 months later, I accepted without hesitation. It was only afterward that I confronted the question of my inheritance. Should I tell this proud, independent man that his fiancée was, in fact, one of the wealthiest women in the state? The decision was complicated by comments Richard had made about wealthy donors to the university, his distaste for how money often dictated educational priorities, his discomfort at fundraising events where he felt professors were treated as entertainment rather than scholars. More telling were his occasional references to his childhood, where his father's financial irresponsibility had forced his mother to work multiple jobs just to keep their family housed and fed. I promised myself I would never be dependent on anyone, he told me once. Everything I have, I've earned through my own efforts. After considerable reflection and a difficult conversation with Theodore, I made my decision. I would keep the Hawthorne fortune separate from our marriage, at least initially. Once Richard and I had built a life together, once his academic career was established on its own merits, I would reveal the truth, and we would decide together how to integrate this aspect of my life. We married in a simple ceremony attended by Richard's academic colleagues and a few of my art course friends, actually the children of my parents' social circle who agreed to maintain the fiction that we had met through university connections. Vivian, already a confidant, served as my maid of honor and sole keeper of my secret. Richard and I purchased a comfortable but modest home near the university, funded primarily by what he believed was my small inheritance from my middle-class parents who had supposedly been insurance adjusters. I took a position teaching art at a local high school, finding unexpected fulfillment in sharing my passion with young minds. Our son James arrived 2 years later, a thoughtful boy with his father's analytical mind and my artistic sensibility. Our family life was rich with intellectual discussion, museum trips, and simple traditions. Richard never questioned why I occasionally needed personal time for family business matters, assuming it related to the small portfolio he believed I had inherited. Through Theodore, I maintained Hawthorne Estate and the family's business interests, visiting the property quarterly under the guise of retreats with former college friends. The estate staff knew me only as Ms. Hawthorne, a family representative who oversaw the property's maintenance, while complex legal issues prevented its full use. For 18 years, this arrangement worked seamlessly. Richard's career flourished based entirely on his scholarly merits. James grew into a bright, creative young man with a particular interest in how structures shaped human experience, an interest that eventually led him to architecture. Our home was filled with books, art, and intellectually stimulating conversation rather than expensive possessions. I had almost convinced myself that this division could continue indefinitely. Richard was approaching his 20-year milestone at the university, and I had planned to finally reveal the truth about Hawthorne Estate as a retirement surprise, a place where he could write the comprehensive architectural history he had always dreamed of producing. Then came the morning when Richard clutched his chest at the breakfast table, his coffee cup shattering on our kitchen floor. Despite the ambulance's swift arrival, he was pronounced dead at the hospital, an undetected heart condition that had been a ticking time bomb throughout his seemingly healthy life. In an instant, the careful separation I had maintained between my two worlds seemed pointless. Yet in the fog of grief, with 17-year-old James looking to me for stability, I couldn't bring myself to upend our lives further by suddenly revealing our true financial situation. Instead, I maintained the fiction, using just enough of the Hawthorne resources to ensure James could attend the prestigious architectural program he had set his heart on, explaining it as careful savings and Richard's life insurance. As James immersed himself in his studies and then his early career, the right moment to reveal the truth never seemed to materialize. He was building his own life, proving himself on his own merits just as his father had done. Wouldn't revealing his heritage undermine that journey? wouldn't it fundamentally alter how he saw himself and his achievements? So I continued teaching, until retirement, maintained our family home, and kept the Hawthorne fortune as my separate shadow life, a decision that had led, through a series of incremental choices and missed opportunities for disclosure, to my current predicament. Locked in a converted storage room while my daughter-in-law systematically worked to erase my presence from my son's life. In the growing morning light filtering through the room's single small window, I acknowledged a difficult truth. My well-intentioned secrecy had created the very vulnerability Margaret was now exploiting. Today would bring not just a revelation of wealth, but a reckoning with decades of decisions that had led to this moment. At precisely 7:30 a.m., I heard Margaret's characteristic 3 sharp knocks before she unlocked my door. This morning ritual, which she referred to as checking in on Mother Hampton, was in reality a daily inspection to ensure I hadn't somehow escaped my confinement or accessed anything she deemed inappropriate for someone of my declining faculties. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying the forced brightness one might use with a child. "Did we sleep well?" The plural pronoun was another of her affectations, speaking to me as though we were a nursing staff addressing a patient. "I slept quite soundly." "Thank you," I replied, already dressed in one of my few remaining outfits, a tailored navy pantsuit I had managed to preserve from Margaret's ongoing closet organization that systematically eliminated my more sophisticated clothing. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly at my attire. "That seems rather formal for a Tuesday at home, doesn't it? I thought you might be more comfortable in one of those lovely loungewear sets I picked up for you." The loungewear in question was a collection of shapeless pastel sweatsuits more suited to a nursing home than daily life, part of her campaign to accelerate my appearance of frailty. "I'm expecting visitors today," I said casually, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from my sleeve. "Visitors?" Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "I don't recall any visitors being scheduled. Who would be visiting on a Tuesday morning?" "Old friends," I replied vaguely. "Vivian will be stopping by, and my attorney." "Your attorney?" The surprise in Margaret's voice sharpened to alarm. "Whatever for. If there are legal matters to address, James can handle them. You know how he worries about you being taken advantage of. These are personal matters, Margaret. Nothing James needs to concern himself with." Margaret's practiced smile tightened at the corners. "Well, I'm afraid today won't work. James and I have plans, and we can't leave you alone with visitors. You know how confused you sometimes get. Perhaps next week, if you give us proper notice." "I won't be requiring supervision," I interrupted, a steel entering my voice that I hadn't used since confronting a school administrator who had tried to cut the arts budget during my teaching days. "And the appointment stands. They'll be arriving at 11. For a moment, Margaret's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the calculation beneath. Then she recovered, pulling her designer cardigan closer as if suddenly chilled. "Eleanor, I'm concerned about your tone. This combativeness. It's one of the symptoms Dr. Mercer mentioned we should watch for." She sighed dramatically. "I think I'd better call James. He'll want to know about this change in your behavior." I had anticipated this response. Margaret's primary strategy whenever challenged was to triangulate through James, presenting my normal assertions of independence as evidence of deterioration. "By all means, call him," I said mildly. "In fact, I insist he be present for this meeting. It concerns him as well." Confusion flickered across Margaret's features, quickly replaced by calculation. I could almost see her mind working through scenarios, trying to identify what attorney I could possibly be meeting and what it might mean for her carefully constructed plans. "I'll speak with James," she finally said. "But I should warn you, Eleanor, if you're planning something impulsive or ill-advised, it will only convince him that we need to move forward with more comprehensive care arrangements." With that parting threat, she closed the door. Leaving it unlocked, I noted, now that the possibility of unexpected visitors had been established. I waited until her footsteps receded down the hallway before retrieving my phone and texting Vivian. First act has begun. Entrance at 10:45 rather than 11 hours. Wear something memorable. Her response was immediate. Darling, I'm already dressed in my crimson Valentino and have been since dawn. Margaret won't know what hit her. I smiled, picturing Vivian in what she called her statement ensemble, a designer suit in a shade of red that complemented her silver hair, which she wore in a dramatic asymmetrical cut despite being well into her 70s. Her arrival would serve as the perfect distraction while the car service delivered the final participants in today's revelation. The next 3 hours unfolded exactly as Margaret would have choreographed them under normal circumstances. James called from his office, his voice carrying the strained patience Margaret had cultivated in him when dealing with me. Mom, Margaret mentioned you've made some appointments without discussing them with us? You know we're happy to help coordinate your schedule. These are personal matters, James. Legal affairs that need addressing. What legal affairs? If you need help with paperwork or decisions, that's what I'm here for. The genuine concern in his voice both warmed and saddened me. James was not a cruel or neglectful son by nature. He had simply accepted Margaret's version of reality because it had been introduced so gradually, each small surrender of my autonomy presented as being for my own good. Nothing to worry about, I assured him. Just some long overdue updates to personal documents. But I would like you to be present, if you can adjust your schedule. There was a pause, then. I'll see what meetings I can move around. Margaret. Mentioned your attorney is coming? Yes, Theodore Winters and his daughter Elise. Another pause, longer this time. Winters? The name sounds familiar, but I don't recall you ever mentioning your attorney before. Theodore has handled my affairs. For many years, I said simply, offering no further explanation. After extracting a promise that I wouldn't tire myself out before their arrival, James ended the call. Within minutes, Margaret appeared in my doorway again, this time with a cup of tea I hadn't requested. James is concerned about you pushing. Yourself? She said, setting the tea on my bedside table. He thinks, we both think, you should rest before your visitors arrive. This tea has a touch of honey, just how you like it. I recognized the routine. The tea would contain a mild sedative, nothing that would render me unconscious, but enough to make me appear slightly confused and forgetful when my visitors arrived, reinforcing the narrative of my decline. How thoughtful, I said, making no move to drink it. I'll enjoy it in a bit. Margaret lingered, clearly waiting for me to take at least a sip. When I didn't, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Don't let it get cold, she advised. I'll be back to check on you shortly. Once she departed, I poured the tea into the potted plant she had placed in my room, a sad specimen that received little light and less care. Perhaps it will either revive you or put you out of your misery, I murmured to the drooping leaves. The morning crawled forward. I heard Margaret on the phone in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones about concerning behavior and resistant to help. She was laying groundwork, I realized, establishing a narrative she could reference later when explaining why more drastic measures had become necessary. At precisely 10:30, I retrieved the leather portfolio from its hiding place and descended the stairs to the main floor for the first time in weeks without being specifically summoned or escorted. I settled myself in the formal living room, a space Margaret reserved exclusively for important guests, and had declared off-limits to me months ago due to concerns about the antiques. I selected the highest back chair, positioned to face the entrance, and placed the portfolio on my lap. Then I waited, my posture perfect, my expression serene, as the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily toward the moment that would change everything. At exactly 10:43, Margaret appeared in the doorway of the formal living room, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation when she saw me seated calmly in the Queen Anne chair she had imported from England at considerable expense. Eleanor, what are you doing down here? And in this room? Her voice carried the exaggerated patience one might use with a disobedient child. You know we keep this space for special occasions. This is a special occasion, I replied evenly. Before she could respond, the doorbell chimed its elaborate Westminster sequence, another of Margaret's affectations, installed to replace the perfectly functional original bell. That will be Vivian, I said. Would you mind letting her in? I'd do it myself, but as you frequently remind me, the front steps are treacherous for someone my age. Margaret's internal struggle played across her features, the desire to refuse warring with the awareness that an unexpected visitor was waiting at the door. Propriety won out, as I had anticipated. Margaret's carefully cultivated image as the perfect hostess wouldn't allow her to leave anyone standing on the doorstep, no matter how unwelcome their arrival. We'll discuss this later, she said with a tight smile before disappearing into the foyer. I heard the front door open, followed immediately by Vivian's theatrical projection. Margaret, darling, how absolutely divine to see you after all this. Time! Is that a new highlight in your hair? Subtle, but it adds such dimension. Vivian's entrance into the living room was exactly the scene-stealing arrival I had expected. Her crimson Valentino suit was accessorized with dramatic black and gold jewelry, and she carried a sleek leather attaché case that matched her designer heels. At 74, Vivian remained a striking figure, tall, slim, and radiating the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her right to occupy any space she entered. "Ellie!" she exclaimed, sweeping across the room to embrace me. "You look fabulous! Whatever your secret is, you simply must share it with the rest of us mere mortals." Margaret followed in Vivian's wake, her expression struggling between maintaining her social mask and processing this unexpected disruption to her controlled environment. "Ms. Blackwell, what a surprise," she managed. "Eleanor didn't mention you would be visiting today. Had we known, we would have prepared properly." "Oh, call me Vivian, please. And no preparation necessary. This isn't a social call, darling." Vivian settled herself elegantly on the sofa across from me, placing her attaché case on the coffee table. "I'm here in a professional capacity." "Professional?" Margaret's confusion was evident. "I thought you were retired from teaching drama." "Oh, the theater was merely Act 1, darling. I've been serving as a trustee for the Hawthorne Foundation for the past 30 years. Eleanor and I have business to discuss." The name Hawthorne registered no recognition with Margaret, exactly as I had expected. She had never bothered to learn my maiden name, despite it appearing on the few personal documents she had accessed while organizing my papers. Before Margaret could inquire further, the doorbell chimed again. "That will be Theodore and Elise," I said calmly. "And likely James as well. He texted that he was leaving his office 20 minutes ago." Margaret's composure slipped further. Events were unfolding outside her control, in her carefully maintained showpiece home, without her orchestration. It was exactly the scenario she had worked so diligently to prevent since the day she entered our lives. The next few minutes brought a flurry of arrivals. Theodore Winters, tall, distinguished, and remarkably spry at 83, entered leaning on a handcrafted walnut cane that I knew he carried more for effect than necessity. His daughter, Elise, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with her father's analytical mind and none of his theatrical tendencies, followed with a sleek briefcase containing the documents we had discussed. James arrived simultaneously, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and wariness as he took in the assembled group in his formal living room. "Mom, what's going on here?" he asked, loosening his tie as he entered. "Margaret called and said you were acting strangely." "Nothing strange about putting one's affairs in order," Theodore interjected, extending his hand to James. "Theodore Winters, your mother's attorney for the past 50 years. This is my daughter and partner, Elise. And I believe you know Vivian Blackwell." James shook their hands automatically, his architect's mind visibly trying to reconstruct a reality that, accommodated these unexpected elements. 50 years? He echoed. But I don't understand. Mom has always handled her own finances. Dad left everything organized before he died, and there wasn't much to manage. Perhaps we should all sit down, I suggested, gesturing to the remaining seats. What I have to share will take some time to explain. Margaret moved to stand beside James, her hand resting possessively on his arm. James, I'm concerned about this. These people showing up unannounced, making claims about professional relationships with your mother that we've never heard of before. It has all the hallmarks of elder exploitation. Theodore gave a short, sharp laugh. My dear young woman, I was protecting Eleanor's interests while you were still playing with dolls. Please spare us the concerned routine. Theodore, I chided, gently, let's maintain civility. Margaret isn't aware of certain facts, which is precisely why we're here today. I turned to my son, whose confusion was rapidly giving way to concern. James, I need to tell you a story, one I should have shared long ago. It begins with my parents, William and Genevieve Hawthorne, and the legacy they left me when they died. Hawthorne? James interrupted. Your maiden name was Hampton, same as Dad's. No, I corrected gently. I was born Eleanor Catherine Hawthorne. When I married your father, I took his name legally, but I maintained separate legal identities for certain aspects of my life. Separate identities? Mom, you're not making sense. Why would you need separate identities? This was the moment, the core of the wound I had created through decades of well-intentioned deception. The pain I was about to cause my son by revealing how thoroughly I had compartmentalized our family life from my inheritance weighed heavily on me. But there was no gentle way to dismantle a lifetime of careful omissions. Because the Hawthorne name carries significant financial and social obligations that your father wanted no part of, I explained. Your father was a proud man who believed in making his own way in the world. When we met, I made a decision to keep my inheritance separate from our marriage out of respect for his values. Inheritance? James's brow furrowed. What inheritance? You told me your parents were middle class, that they left you a small insurance policy and the house you grew up in. That was not accurate, I admitted. My parents left me considerably more than that. Margaret's grip on James's arm tightened. James, I think your mother might be confused about the past. We've noticed these confabulations increasing recently. It's part of why we've been so concerned. Vivian made a small theatrical sound of disgust. Oh, for heaven's sake! Eleanor! Enough dancing around. Show him the portfolio before Miss Perfect daughter-in-law spontaneously combusts from suppressed panic. With a small nod of acknowledgement to Vivian's characteristic bluntness, I opened the leather portfolio and removed the deed to Hawthorne Estate, along with recent photographs of the property. I passed them to James, whose hands accepted them, automatically while his eyes remained fixed on my face, searching for signs of the confusion Margaret had been reporting. What is this? He asked, finally glancing down at the documents in his hands. The truth, James, I said quietly. The truth I should have shared with you years ago, but never found the right moment to reveal. The truth about who I am, and by extension, who you are. James stared at the deed and photographs, his trained architect's eye registering details that would have escaped most observers. The classical proportions of the Georgian facade, the quality of craftsmanship evident even in still images, the scale of the estate grounds stretching toward the lake. This is, he began, then faltered. Hawthorne Estate, I supplied. 22 acres on Lake Champlain, including the main residence with 16 rooms, the carriage house, gardener's cottage, and boathouse. It has been in my family since 1897, when my great-grandfather commissioned its construction after the shipping business expanded to the East Coast. Margaret moved behind James, examining the photographs over his shoulder. I watched the calculations running behind her eyes as she processed the implications. You own this? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I do, I confirmed, along with other properties and investments managed through the Hawthorne Trust. The full portfolio summary is here. I nodded to Elise, who extracted a bound financial statement from her briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. But this is... James shook his head, struggling to reconcile this revelation with his understanding of our family history. We lived in a 3-bedroom colonial. Dad drove the same Volvo for 15 years. You clipped coupons and bought my clothes at department store sales. Yes, I acknowledged. That was the life your father and I chose to live. Chose? The confusion in James's voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. You're saying you could have lived like this? He held up the photographs. But instead, you chose to live modestly? To work as a teacher? To worry about college tuition and mortgage payments? Your father was a man of principle, James. He believed in earning his own way, in the dignity of work regardless of financial reward. When we met, I was 23, and had only recently inherited the Hawthorne Estate after my parents' deaths. Richard was building his academic career and had strong feelings about wealth and privilege. So, you lied to him? James's voice held, a note of incredulity. I made a compromise, I corrected gently. I kept the Hawthorne assets separate from our marriage, maintaining 2 distinct aspects of my life out of respect for your father's values. The plan was always to tell him once his career was established, to give him the choice of how we might integrate this aspect of my life into our future. But you never told him. The simple statement hung in the air, an indictment more powerful for its lack of emotional inflection. I never found the right moment, I admitted. The years passed, our life together had its own rhythm and satisfactions. Richard found fulfillment in his work, in our family, in the life we built together. The inheritance began to feel like a complication that might disrupt rather than enhance our happiness. And after Dad died? What about then? This was the question I had dreaded most, the one that exposed the weakest justification for my continued secrecy. After your father died, you were 17, preparing for college, grieving. Revealing this separate life seemed like an unnecessary burden to place on you then. Later, as you established your own career, I saw in you the same pride and self-reliance that your father had embodied. The right moment to share this truth never seemed to arrive. James set the photographs down carefully, his movements deliberate in the way they always were when he was processing complex information. His architectural training had taught him to analyze structural systems holistically, to see how separate elements interconnected to create a complete framework. Now he was applying that same analytical approach to reconstructing the narrative of his family history. So, for my entire life, for Dad's entire marriage to you, this other existence was running in parallel. These art retreats you took 4 times a year. Those were visits to this estate? Yes, I acknowledged, along with meetings to review the trust's holdings and investments. The trust that paid for my education? His voice took on a sharper edge. The money you said came from Dad's life insurance and your careful saving? The life insurance was real, I clarified. But yes, it was supplemented by trust funds. Margaret, who had remained uncharacteristically silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Her voice carried a note of wounded innocence that might have been convincing to anyone who hadn't spent 8 months observing her manipulative tactics. Eleanor, I'm struggling to understand why you would keep this hidden from your own family. From James, who has done nothing but try to support you, especially since your difficulties began. Theodore made a small noise that might have been a suppressed snort. Vivian was less restrained. Oh, spare us the devoted daughter-in-law routine, Margaret, she said. You've been systematically isolating Eleanor since the day you moved her into this house. Or should we discuss the medications you've been slipping into her tea? The documents you've had James sign without fully explaining their contents? The concerns you've been sharing with their family physician while excluding Eleanor from her own medical consultations? Margaret's face flushed, then paled. Those are absolutely unfounded accusations. James, are you going to let these people speak to me this way in our own home? James held up a hand, not looking at his wife. One thing at a time. He turned back to me. Mom, I'm trying to understand. You've maintained this secret life, this fortune, for decades. You allowed me to believe we were a middle-class family with modest means. You watched me struggle through architecture school, taking extra jobs to make ends meet, while you had, what, millions sitting in accounts? The struggle is what shaped you, James, I said quietly. Just as it shaped your father. Would you have become the man you are today if everything had been handed to you without effort? That wasn't your decision to make. For the first time, real anger broke through his confusion. You denied both Dad and me the right to choose how we felt about this inheritance. You decided for us. The truth of his accusation struck me with physical force. In my well-intentioned efforts to protect Richard's pride and James's development, I had indeed made unilateral decisions that shaped their lives without their knowledge or consent. You're right, I said simply. I believed I was honoring your father's values, and later, protecting your opportunity to develop your own identity independent of family wealth. But in doing so, I overstepped. I made choices that should have been shared decisions. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it momentarily took my breath away. Why now? He asked finally. After all these decades of secrecy, why reveal this now? It was the opening I had been waiting for, though I took no pleasure in the necessity of what would follow. Because circumstances have forced my hand, I replied, turning my gaze to Margaret. Because I've spent the past 8 months experiencing a systematic campaign to diminish my autonomy, discredit my mental capacity, and ultimately gain control of what my daughter-in-law believed were my modest assets. Because I can no longer protect you by remaining silent. In that moment, I saw within my son the collision of his two inheritances, his father's principled integrity and my pragmatic caution. The conflict played across his features as he turned slowly to look at his wife, seeing her perhaps with clear eyes for the first time since their courtship. "Margaret?" he asked, the single word carrying a weight of questions. And in that question, that first crack in the facade she had so carefully constructed, I witnessed the beginning of Margaret's reckoning. Margaret's recovery was impressive, in its speed and execution. In the space of a heartbeat, her expression transformed from startled calculation to wounded dignity. "James, surely you don't believe these absurd accusations." Her voice trembled with precisely calibrated vulnerability. "I've done nothing but try to care for your mother since she moved in with us. Yes, I've been concerned about her cognitive changes. Yes, I've consulted with doctors because you were too busy to attend those appointments. But everything I've done has been out of love for you and concern for Eleanor." She moved away from the photographs, positioning herself at the center of the room as if instinctively seeking the strongest staging for her performance. "Think about what's happening here," she continued, her voice steadying as she gained momentum. "Your mother, who by her own admission has been living a double life for decades, suddenly produces documents claiming vast wealth and properties none of us have ever seen. She arrives with an attorney we've never met and a friend who makes wild accusations about medication and manipulation. Doesn't this strike you as exactly the kind of elder exploitation situation we've been warned about? It was masterfully done." Margaret had taken the very real concerns I was raising about her behavior and inverted them, suggesting that my advocates were the true manipulators. I had anticipated this strategy, but watching it unfold, seeing how effectively she leveraged the foundation of doubt she had been laying for months, was nonetheless unsettling. Theodore cleared his throat. "If I may interject, Mrs. Hampton," he said, addressing Margaret with deliberate formality, "the documentation we've brought isn't merely a collection of claims. The deed to Hawthorne Estate is registered with the county. The trust documents bear the seal of the Commonwealth and signatures of multiple witnesses. The financial statements come directly from institutions where these accounts have been maintained for decades. He turned to James. Your mother has maintained her privacy regarding these matters, but there has never been any question of the legal standing of her inheritance or her competence to manage it. James's expression remained guarded as he looked between Theodore and Margaret. I recognized his struggle, the architect's instinct to trust in solid documentation warring with the husband's instinct to trust his wife's emotional appeals. I'd like to see proof, he said finally. Not just papers that could be drafted by anyone, but actual verification that this estate exists and belongs to my mother. A reasonable request, Elise responded promptly. We anticipated you might want external verification. She removed a tablet from her briefcase, activated it, and placed it on the coffee table. This is a secure video connection to Stuart Campbell, the property manager at Hawthorne Estate. He's expecting our call. Before Margaret could object, Elise initiated the connection. After a moment, the screen displayed the weathered face of a man in his 60s, standing in what was clearly a well-appointed study. Ms. Winters, he acknowledged with a nod. Is Mrs. Hampton available? I'm here, Stuart, I confirmed, moving into view of the tablet's camera. Along with my son James, whom you've heard me mention over the years. Stuart's expression brightened. Mr. Hampton, a pleasure to finally meet you, even virtually. Your mother speaks of you often during her quarterly visits. Quarterly visits, James repeated, his tone neutral, but his eyes reflecting growing acceptance of this alternate reality. Yes, sir. Mrs. Hampton has maintained the regular inspection schedule, established by her father, despite maintaining the property's private status. Is there something specific you'd like to see to verify the estate's condition? James glanced at the photographs again. The main entrance hall, if possible. Stuart nodded and began walking, the tablet's view shifting as he moved through the house. The estate has been maintained in accordance with historical preservation standards, he explained as he walked. The original millwork and plasterwork are intact throughout, though we've modernized systems like heating, plumbing, and security without compromising the historical integrity. He entered a grand foyer dominated by a sweeping staircase with intricate balustrades. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating parquet floors and walls adorned with what appeared to be museum-quality artwork. This is the main entrance hall, Stuart confirmed, panning slowly to provide a comprehensive view. The portraits on the left wall are of the Hawthorne family, including Mrs. Hampton's parents and grandparents. The landscape over the fireplace is an original Thomas Cole commissioned by her great-grandfather. James leaned forward, his professional appreciation for the architecture momentarily overriding his personal turmoil. That staircase, the proportions are remarkable, and the ceiling medallion. Is that original? Yes, sir. Hand-carved plaster, restored in 1982 under Mrs. Hampton's supervision. As Stuart continued the virtual tour, showing the main public rooms of the estate, I watched James's face. The evidence was undeniable, the reality of Hawthorne Estate too substantial to dismiss as fabrication. With each room revealed, the foundation of Margaret's counter-narrative crumbled further. That's, James faltered. That's sufficient, thank you. Margaret had remained unnaturally still during the video call, her expression frozen in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As Elise ended the connection, this carefully maintained composure fractured. This proves nothing, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. So there's a house that matches the photographs. That doesn't mean Eleanor owns it. For all we know, these people could be conspirators in some elaborate scheme. To what end, Margaret? I asked quietly. What possible motive would I have for fabricating ownership of a property I've never shared with my family? What would these supposed conspirators gain? Control of James's assets, obviously. You've seen how these scams work. They isolate vulnerable seniors from their families, convince them they have hidden wealth, then drain their accounts and their children's accounts to access this fictional fortune. James had risen during this exchange and moved to examine the financial statements Elise had provided. His trained eye for detail was scanning the documents, noting dates, account numbers, transaction histories. These go back decades, he said almost to himself. Consistent patterns of management, the same signatures on documents spanning 40 years. He looked up at Theodore. These could still be fabricated, but it would require an extraordinarily sophisticated operation. Indeed it would, Theodore agreed. Fortunately, there's a simpler way to verify everything. Eleanor, shall we proceed to the next phase? I nodded, and Theodore produced a sealed envelope from his inside pocket. Inside is a cashier's check drawn on the Hawthorne Trust's primary account at Boston Private Bank and Trust Company. The branch. Manager is expecting you, along with verification documents we can provide. A simple visit to the bank will confirm the authenticity of the account and Eleanor's control of it. And how large is this supposed account? Margaret asked, unable to contain her curiosity despite her affected skepticism. The main operating account contains approximately $3 million, Theodore replied matter-of-factly. It's maintained at that level for ongoing expenses and immediate needs. The bulk of the liquid assets are held in various investment accounts totaling approximately $47 million as of last quarter's statement. The room fell silent. Even Vivian, who had been enjoying Margaret's discomfort with poorly concealed satisfaction, seemed sobered by the concrete figure being attached to the abstract concept of my wealth. James broke the silence, his voice strained. $47 million, plus this estate, plus other properties you mentioned, plus the art collection, investment portfolios, and minority stakes in several businesses, Elise added. The complete net worth statement is included in the ER documentation. And you've managed all of this secretly while living on a teacher's pension? His voice held equal parts disbelief and dawning comprehension. The separation wasn't always easy to maintain, I admitted. But yes, with Theodore's help and careful compartmentalization, I've kept the Hawthorne holdings separate from our daily life. Why reveal all of this now? Margaret demanded, her voice sharper than she likely intended. Why not continue your secrecy if it was so important to you for all these decades? It was the question I had been waiting for, the opening that would allow me to address the true purpose of this meeting beyond the mere revelation of my inheritance. Because 8 months ago, I said evenly, I made the mistake of agreeing to sell my home and move in with you and James, believing it was a temporary arrangement while repairs were completed. Instead, I found myself relegated to a storage room, isolated from friends, deprived of basic autonomy, and subjected to a systematic campaign to undermine my mental capacity, a campaign that coincidentally began shortly after you discovered the proceeds from my home sale were considerably less than you had anticipated. Margaret's face flushed. That's absurd. James, are you going to let her talk about me this way? But James was looking at me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in months. The room, he said slowly. You said it was fine, that you understood space was tight during the renovations. What choice did I have? I asked gently. Each time I raised concerns, Margaret explained to you that I was confused or having one of my difficult days. Each objection became further, evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. That's a lie, Margaret interjected. I've done everything to make you comfortable. Including installing a lock on the outside of my door? I asked. Including isolating me from the few friends who tried to visit? Including gradually eliminating my more sophisticated clothing so I would appear frumpy and confused at the few social gatherings you couldn't avoid including me in? I turned to James. Including convincing you that I needed medications I was never prescribed, which she administered in my food and drinks without my knowledge or consent? James's gaze shifted to Margaret, a new wariness in his expression. The lock. You told me it was for Mom's safety, that the doctor recommended it after she started wandering at night. She was wandering, Margaret insisted. Remember when we found her in the kitchen at 3 a.m.? She didn't even know what she was doing there. I was getting water, I said calmly. As I explained at the time, the cups had been moved from their usual cabinet, and I was looking for them. Cups that had been in the same location for 6 months, Margaret countered. Just one of many incidents that demonstrated your increasing confusion. Incidents that conveniently began after I moved into your home, I noted, and escalated whenever I questioned your decisions regarding my care or possessions. James turned to Theodore. You mentioned medication. What medication? Theodore nodded to Elise, who produced a sealed evidence bag containing several tablets. These were collected from beverages Margaret prepared for Eleanor over the past month, Elise explained. We had them analyzed by an independent laboratory. She handed James a printed report. They contain a combination of over-the-counter sleep aids and lorazepam, a prescription anxiety medication known to cause confusion, memory issues, and drowsiness, particularly in elderly patients. That's preposterous, Margaret's voice rose sharply. James, they're planting evidence to turn you against me. This is exactly the kind of manipulative tactic these elder scammers use, dividing families to isolate vulnerable seniors. The prescription, Elise continued calmly, is registered to Margaret Hampton. She slid a pharmacy printout across the table. Filled 6 times in the past 8 months at Cambridge Pharmacy. The pharmacist remembers Mrs. Hampton specifically because she explained that it was for her anxious mother-in-law, but requested that the medication information be kept discreet because Eleanor gets so upset about needing medication. The room fell into stunned silence as James examined the pharmacy record, his expression increasingly troubled. Margaret, he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this true? Have you been medicating my mother without her knowledge? Margaret's composure cracked further, her carefully maintained mask slipping to reveal glimpses of desperation beneath. Was trying to help her, she insisted. The doctor said her anxiety was making her confusion worse. She refused to take the pills when I offered them directly. Because I don't have an anxiety disorder, I interjected quietly. Nor do I have dementia, Alzheimer's, or any of the other conditions you've suggested to James I might be developing. The consulting neurologist confirmed that last week, Theodore added. Eleanor underwent a complete cognitive assessment at Massachusetts General Hospital. The results indicate cognitive function well above average for her age group, with no signs of dementia or other neurodegenerative conditions. James's breath escaped in a short, pained sound. You had Mom evaluated without telling me? We needed independent medical documentation, Elise explained, given the narrative that had been established about Eleanor's supposed cognitive decline. A narrative supported by her behavior while under the influence of unprescribed sedatives, Vivian added pointedly. James rose abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the room as he processed these revelations. The rigid set of his shoulders betrayed the tension coursing through him. There's more, I said gently, though I take no pleasure in sharing it. James didn't turn, but nodded almost imperceptibly, granting permission to continue. 2 months ago, Margaret began discussing the possibility of selling my former home, claiming that the repairs were proving more extensive than initially estimated. When I explained that I still wanted to return there once renovations were complete, she suggested, within your hearing, that I seemed confused about the plans we had all agreed to. I paused, allowing James to recall the incident I was referencing. What you don't know, I continued, is that my home was never damaged to the extent Margaret claimed. The water leak affected only the kitchen and was covered by insurance. The contractor completed the repairs within 6 weeks, but Margaret continued to report complications and delays to explain why I couldn't return. James turned slowly. How do you know this? Because I hired an independent inspector to assess the property when Margaret's reports seemed increasingly inconsistent, I explained. He found the repairs had been properly completed months ago. The house has been standing empty, despite Margaret's claims about ongoing construction. That's not possible, James objected. I signed checks for the contractor. I saw the estimates for the extended repairs. Yes, I acknowledged. You signed checks that Margaret then altered before they were processed. The contractor confirmed he received only the original agreed-upon amount for the initial repairs. The remainder, Elise added, was diverted to an account at Cambridge Savings Bank, opened 6 months ago in both James and Margaret's names, but with statements sent to a P.O. box rather than your home address. She slid another document across the table. Approximately $87,000 has been diverted from the renovation funds, along with an additional $42,000 from Eleanor's personal accounts, accessed using a power of attorney document that Eleanor never signed. Margaret's face had drained of color. James, this is insane. They're fabricating evidence to create some elaborate conspiracy theory. But James was already examining the bank statements, his expression hardening as he recognized the transactions. These are the renovation payments, and this withdrawal, this matches the check I thought we wrote for the new roof. He looked up at Margaret. There was never any roof damage, was there? I can explain everything, Margaret insisted, her voice taking on a desperate edge. These people are manipulating your mother, planting ideas, creating forged documents. The signatures on the diverted checks, Elise interrupted calmly, have been examined by a forensic handwriting expert who has confirmed they were altered, after James signed them. The expert's report is included in your documentation package. James closed his eyes briefly, as if physically pained by each new revelation. When he opened them, his gaze settled on me with a mixture of anguish and dawning comprehension. The assisted living brochures, he said quietly. The ones you said Mom had been reviewing. She never asked for those, did she? No, I confirmed, gently. That was part of the next phase of Margaret's plan. Once my former home was sold, which she was actively pursuing without my knowledge using the falsified power of attorney, the proceeds would be placed in the joint account she had established. I would then be transferred to Lakeside Manor, the assisted living facility she's been corresponding with for the past 3 months. Correspondence she conducted using your email account, Vivian added, which she accessed after installing monitoring software on your laptop. We have the digital forensics report confirming this. The methodical presentation of evidence continued, each new document adding to the incontrovertible case against Margaret. Bank records showing unusual transfers. Emails she had sent impersonating. James to inquire about liquidating my modest investment accounts. Recordings of phone calls to my former doctor, during which she had suggested symptoms I had never experienced. As the evidence mounted, Margaret's denials became increasingly fragmented and contradictory. Her carefully constructed persona of the devoted daughter-in-law concerned about an elderly relative's well-being crumbled under the weight of documented facts. You don't understand, she finally said, abandoning her denials for a different approach. James was working himself to exhaustion trying to support all of us. His firm was cutting back hours, projects were being delayed, and Eleanor's care was becoming increasingly expensive. I was trying to secure our future, our family's future. By defrauding my mother? James asked, his voice quiet but deadly serious. By drugging her to make her appear incompetent? By planning to institutionalize her against her will? It wasn't like that, Margaret protested. I was being practical. Eleanor wasn't using her assets effectively. That house was sitting empty most of the time. Her investments were conservative when they could have been growing faster under better management. I was trying to optimize what little we had. What little we had, James repeated, the phrase clearly striking him as significant. You thought we were struggling to manage on my income and Mom's modest savings. That's why you targeted her assets. Margaret recognized her mistake too late. I wasn't targeting anything. I was trying to consolidate our resources for everyone's benefit. And if you had known about the Hawthorne inheritance? I asked quietly. What would your plans have been then? The question hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. Margaret's face flushed, then paled again as she realized the corner she had backed herself into. This is absurd, she said finally. You're twisting everything to make me look like some kind of villain. James, you know me. You know I only wanted what was best for our family. But James was looking at his wife with new eyes, reassessing 6 years of marriage through the lens of these revelations. In his expression, I could see the painful recalibration taking place, the architect's mind rebuilding his understanding of his own life with revised specifications. I thought I knew you, he said at last, but I'm not sure I ever did. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11:30, its resonant tones filling the silence that had descended upon the living room. Margaret remained standing, her posture increasingly defensive as James continued to examine the evidence. Arrayed before him, I think, James said finally, his voice controlled but strained, that I need some time to process all of this. Margaret seized on this opening. Of course you do, darling. It's overwhelming. All these accusations, these elaborate documents. Why don't we ask everyone to leave and we can discuss this privately? I can explain everything if these people aren't here twisting my words. Actually, James replied, not looking at her, I think you should be the one to leave, Margaret. She stared at him, momentarily speechless. Leave? This is our home. A home purchased with the proceeds from my architectural bonus and your supposed inheritance from your aunt, James said quietly. Except there was no inheritance, was there? The money appeared in our joint account the same week Mom's insurance settlement for the kitchen repairs was issued. Margaret's expression flickered. James, you're confused. My inheritance was $145,000, James finished for her. The exact amount of Mom's insurance settlement, plus the proceeds from selling her car because she shouldn't be driving at her age. A coincidence I somehow never questioned until this moment. Theodore cleared his throat. If I may, we've prepared a summary of financial transactions showing the correlation between funds removed from Eleanor's accounts and subsequent deposits into accounts controlled by Margaret. The pattern is quite consistent over the 8 months since Eleanor moved into your home. James held up a hand. I don't need to see it right now. I believe you. He turned to Margaret, his expression hardening. I'd like you to go upstairs, pack what you need for a few days and leave. We'll discuss arrangements for the rest of your things later. Margaret's composure shattered completely. You can't be serious. You're choosing your mother, who has lied to you your entire life about who she really is, about this supposed fortune, over your wife? James, think about what you're doing. I'm thinking very clearly for the first time in months, James replied. Maybe for the first time since I met you. I'm seeing patterns I should have recognized long ago. What patterns? That I've been trying to secure our financial future? That I've been caring for your increasingly difficult mother while you focused on your career? That I've sacrificed my own professional ambitions to maintain our home? That? You consistently isolated me from friends who questioned your narratives, James countered, his voice gaining strength. That you've intercepted communications between me and my colleagues, my clients, even my mother. That my career has mysteriously stalled since our marriage, with promising projects reassigned and promotions passed over. He stood, squaring his shoulders. That the woman I married appears to be a carefully constructed fiction designed to secure financial stability at any cost. Margaret's face contorted with fury and desperation. This is insane. You're throwing away our marriage based on a few hours of manipulative presentations from people you've just met. People claiming your mother, who has been showing clear signs of cognitive decline, suddenly owns some massive estate we've never seen. We've seen it, James replied quietly. Just now, via video. And the cognitive decline you've been reporting? Symptoms that miraculously appeared only after she moved in with us. and you began controlling her food and medication. I want a second opinion, Margaret insisted. I want Eleanor evaluated by our doctor, not some specialist they've selected. That's reasonable, I interjected, surprising everyone. I'm happy to be evaluated by any board-certified neurologist. Of your choosing, Margaret. In fact, I welcome it. But the evaluation will be conducted with James present, not with you providing a pre-assessment narrative of my supposed symptoms. Margaret looked between us, recognizing the trap closing around her. Her options were evaporating with each passing minute. This isn't over, she said finally, her voice low and dangerous. You've manipulated my husband, turned him against me with your lies and these fake documents. But I have rights. This is my home too, and I won't be thrown out based on a pack of fabrications. Margaret, James said wearily, please don't make this more difficult than it already is. Pack your things and go to your sister's. We'll sort through the legal details once I've had time to consult with an attorney. An attorney? Margaret's voice rose sharply. You're talking about divorce? Over this? The pain in James's eyes was answer enough. Margaret's gaze darted around the room, assessing and discarding potential strategies. Then, with a final glare of undisguised hatred directed at me, she stormed from the room, her footsteps echoing up the staircase. The breaking point had arrived, and the carefully constructed facade had finally shattered beyond repair. When Margaret's footsteps faded, followed by the sharp slam of the master bedroom door, a heavy silence descended upon the living room. James sank back into his chair, looking, suddenly older and deeply exhausted. I should go up there, he said after a moment. Make sure she doesn't... I don't know what she might do. That's been addressed, Elise said calmly. We anticipated potential destruction of property or documents. 2 security professionals from our firm are discreetly stationed at the front and back entrances. They'll ensure Margaret leaves with only her personal belongings. James nodded absently, still processing the seismic shift in his reality. He turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of hurt, confusion, and dawning comprehension. All these years, he said quietly, this whole other life you've been living, the estate, the investments, the properties. Why, Mom? Why keep all of it secret from me? It was the fundamental question, the one that cut to the heart of decades of well-intentioned deception. I reached across the space between us and took his hand, relieved when he didn't pull away. I made a decision when I met your father that seemed right at the time. I began. Richard was building his career based on merit, on intellectual contribution rather than financial advantage. He distrusted inherited privilege, having seen how it affected his colleagues at the university. But after he died, James pressed, I was his son, not him. Didn't I deserve to know my own heritage? Yes, I acknowledged simply. You did. But by then, the separation between my 2 lives had become habitual. I watched you developing your own talents, earning your own accomplishments. I feared that revealing the inheritance would somehow diminish your sense of self-earned success. That wasn't your decision to make, he said, echoing his earlier accusation. No, I agreed. It wasn't. I convinced myself I was protecting you, honoring your father's values. But I was also protecting myself from having to integrate these separate aspects of my identity. I squeezed his hand gently. I was wrong, James. I should have trusted you with the truth years ago. My secrecy, however well-intentioned, created the very vulnerability that Margaret exploited. He nodded slowly, processing this admission. And now? What happens now? I straightened in my chair, reclaiming not just my posture, but my full identity. Eleanor, Catherine Hawthorne Hampton, heir to the Hawthorne legacy, woman of independent means and character. Now, I said with quiet confidence, I return to Hawthorne Estate, which has been prepared for my arrival. I resume my life as Eleanor Hawthorne, with all the responsibilities and privileges that entails. And you, my son, must decide what relationship you wish to have with me going forward, not as the retired teacher with modest means who raised you, but as the woman I truly am, with all my flaws and complexities. I reached for the leather portfolio, now filled with the evidence of my reclaimed identity. The question isn't what happens to me now, James. The estate has always been there, waiting. The question is what happens to you. What will you do with this new understanding of your family legacy? As I spoke these words, I felt the weight of decades of duplicity lifting from my shoulders. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation or further estrangement, I would face it as my complete self, no longer compartmentalized, no longer diminished. The moment of reclamation had arrived, not just of my property and legal rights, but of my whole identity. The following day dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows of the guest room, my last morning in that confined space. I had slept surprisingly well, the culmination of months of planning having lifted an immense burden from my shoulders. Margaret had departed the previous afternoon, escorted discreetly but firmly by Theodore's security personnel. She had taken only 2 suitcases, her expression locked in cold fury as she entered the waiting taxi. James had watched from the doorway, his face impassive but his shoulders bearing the weight of broken trust and shattered illusions. We had spoken little after Margaret's departure. James needed space to process both my revelations and his wife's betrayal. I respected that need, retiring early to my room and leaving him to sit in his study with a glass of scotch and the comprehensive documentation Elise had provided. Now, as I packed my few remaining possessions, I heard a gentle knock at the door. "Come in," I called, folding a scarf Vivian had given me years ago. James entered carrying a cup of coffee. He had clearly slept poorly, the shadows under his eyes testifying to a night of difficult reflection. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting the coffee on the small bedside table. "I remember. You always preferred dark roast." "Thank you," I replied, touched by this small gesture of normalcy amid our transformed relationship. He glanced around the cramped room, seeing it perhaps truly for the first time. The inadequate storage, the poor lighting, the lack of basic comforts. "I can't believe I let her put you in here," he said quietly. "Right under my nose, and I never questioned it." "Love creates blind spots," I offered gently. "I had my own where your father was concerned, where you were concerned." He nodded, accepting this parallel without comment. Theodore called. "The car will be here at 10 to take you to the estate." "Yes," I confirmed. "Hawthorne has been prepared for my arrival. Stuart has been overseeing the final arrangements." An awkward silence fell between us, filled with unasked questions and unspoken emotions. "I'd like to see it," James said finally. "The estate. Not today, but soon, if that's all right." "Of course," I replied, hope blooming cautiously within me. "It's your heritage too, James. Whenever you're ready, you're welcome there." He helped me carry my suitcase downstairs when the car arrived. A sleek black sedan driven by an unobtrusive professional who loaded my meager belongings without comment. The contrast between this dignified departure and Margaret's tense exit the day before wasn't lost on either of us. On the front steps, James hesitated, then embraced me briefly. "I'm still processing everything," he admitted. The inheritance, Margaret's deception, the fact that my entire understanding of our family has been incomplete. "Take all the time you need," I said. "I've waited decades to fully reconcile these parts of my life. I can wait a little longer for you to reconcile them too." He stepped back, hands in his pockets. "What will you do now? At Hawthorne, I mean." I smiled, feeling the first true stirrings of freedom. "Live, James. Simply live as my complete self, without compartments or constraints. For the first time in nearly 50 years, I'll be just one person, not Eleanor the teacher or Eleanor the Hawthorne heir, but all of me, integrated and whole. As the car pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at the townhouse that had been my elegant prison. My gaze was fixed forward, toward the path of liberation that stretched before me, leading home to Hawthorne and to myself. 3 months. Later, I stood on the wide veranda of Hawthorne Estate, watching the autumn sunlight dance across Lake Champlain. The maples and oaks that lined the property's edge had turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold, their reflection shimmering on the water's surface. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and late-blooming roses from the gardens below. "More tea, Mrs. Hampton?" asked Maria, the housekeeper who had quickly become not just a staff member, but a valued companion in my new life. "Thank you, Maria," I replied, smiling as she refreshed my cup. "And please, I've asked you to call me Eleanor." "Old habits," she said with a warm smile. "Mr. Stewart ran a formal household for so many years, but we're all adjusting to the new. Hawthorne, indeed we were. The estate that had stood in elegant suspension for decades was now fully alive again. Rooms that had been shrouded in dust covers now basked in sunlight. The formal gardens had been subtly redesigned to include spaces for outdoor gatherings. The kitchen, once operated minimally during my quarterly visits, now hummed with activity, as I rediscovered my love of cooking in a space that would have made professional chefs envious. Most significantly, the estate was no longer a secret refuge, but my acknowledged home, a place where I could finally integrate all aspects of my identity. Vivian visited often, delighting in finally being able to openly enjoy the luxury she had known about for years. Theodore and Elise came monthly to review business matters that I now approached with undiminished acumen but newfound transparency. And James, my son, was finding his way back to me, slowly but steadily. His divorce from Margaret was proceeding, the financial entanglements unwound with Elise's expert assistance. He had visited Hawthorne twice, initially overwhelmed by the estate's grandeur, but gradually becoming comfortable as he recognized elements that connected to our shared past. Books from his childhood found places on Hawthorne's library shelves, photographs of Richard now displayed prominently in the study. His own architectural awards honored in the gallery alongside Hawthorne family achievements. The sound of tires on gravel drew my attention to the driveway below. James's car appeared around the curve, right on time for our standing Sunday lunch. He was bringing the preliminary designs for the boathouse renovation, his first project, at Hawthorne, combining his professional expertise with our reconnecting family bonds. I smiled, watching him emerge from the car and look up at the house, at me, with a wave of recognition. Not everything was healed between us yet, but we were building something new on foundations of truth rather than well-intentioned deception. At 72, I had finally come home to myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.